Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Groundings with My Brothers by Walter Rodney. Narrated by Butler. Editor's Introduction. The Groundings with My Brothers is important in so many ways. It is perhaps the most direct representation of Walter Rodney's natural voice during the early period of his work. These Groundings talks, which became chapters, represent Rodney's voice as a very young professor, post-PhD, engaging with Jamaica in 1968, when he was just 26 years old. Now, 50 years since its original publication by Bogle Louverture Press, it remains vital and relevant, addressing key issues of black consciousness, black power, the role of the academic and intellectual, the Jamaica situation, African history, colonialism and its legacies, liberation, and transnational engagement of racialized police brutality. It is a compulsory text to be used in community work, undergraduate courses, high schools, unions, and popular education. For several years, the editors have worked with Patricia Rodney and the Walter Rodney Foundation WRF board, as well as its advisory board, members, and friends, to secure and consolidate a permanent publishing home for Walter Rodney's primary works. We are now able to call Verso Books the new home of Walter Rodney's works. The Groundings with My Brothers is the third Rodney book, after The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World, July 2018, and the new edition of his classic How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, November 2018. We appreciate the willingness of Verso to maintain this critical work as a standalone text, and their embrace of and assistance with our plan to add a second part, with reflective essays and commentaries from leading thinkers whose work intersects with Rodney's and illuminates important new aspects of it. At some point, we realized that we had already been serving as de facto editors, and accepted this role as we worked to complete the project. We made a hard decision, along with Verso, not to include the original introductions, in order to keep the book relatively small, so that it could continue to be accessible, from a cost perspective, to a wide cross-section of readers. We intend to make the prior introductions available on the Verso and/or WRF websites. We were fortunate to secure an introduction by Carol Boyce Davies and essays from David Austin, Randall Robinson, Patricia Rodney, Vereen Shepard, and Robin Bongo Jerry Small. We chose to order these unique contributions in terms of chronology and scope, starting with personal reflections by Patricia, then Memories of the Groundings in Jamaica by Bongo Jerry, followed by an essay on the Montreal Congress by David. We then conclude with an essay by Vereen with its broad scope, and finally, a meditation on the meaning of a life in service of liberation by Randall. The introduction by Carol Boyce Davies brilliantly frames the work as a must-read book of historical resonance and carries it to a new generation. Carol expounds that Rodney provides us with the ability to make knowledge real, in service of our communities, and more incisively, provides us with the ability to impact our innate understandings of the world. Recollections by Patricia Rodney, Walter Rodney's wife, provide listeners with invaluable personal observations, recollections, and context. She reflects on the groundings process that, though organic to Rodney, led to internal disruptions and is recognized as a major event in Caribbean history. Robin Bongo Jerry Small shares a scintillating first-hand account of the groundings, his experience working with Rodney during the tumultuous and impactful 9 months he was in Jamaica. His poignant memories provide a unique window into the work and impact of Rodney in the Jamaican context. David Austin provides an account of critical events not previously available to most readers, about the 1968 Black Writers' Congress in Montreal, during which word of Walter Rodney's ban from returning to Jamaica was announced. Important details of the interactions with Stokely Carmichael, Robert Bobby Hill, and others provide important details for scholars and new insight into the dynamics of social movements that have shaped our history. Vereen Shepard provides a brilliant theoretical and historical sketch of Rodney's impact and continuing relevance. She situates Rodney as providing the ideological orientation for many people in the Caribbean and diaspora, and for the creation of the public intellectual as scholar-advocate. Randall Robinson, of Trans-Africa Forum renown, provides a concise meditation on Rodney's praxis in general, an incisive meta-analysis on what it means to tend to one's brothers and sisters, especially the dispossessed. Several people at Verso need to be specifically acknowledged for sharing in our vision of Rodney's legacy. Andy Shao for helping develop and secure our overall plan with Verso, Ben Mabey, our main point of contact, who guided this project to its completion, and Duncan Ranslam and his editorial team for their flexibility and precision. Special thanks to Vijay Prasad and Robin D.G. Kelly for helping develop the relationship with Verso Books, and to Roger Van Zwanenberg and Faraji Manji for supporting this work. Our appreciation to A.J. Murphy for his continued work behind the scenes, and to Jesse Benjamin's students in the Walter Rodney Speakers Series course and his other courses for their proofing and comments, and to everyone who helped at various stages of this project and who supported the broader vision of the WRF. Finally, our deep gratitude to our contributors for their reflective essays and timely revisions. This is the context of struggle and grounding that helped produce this volume. We are excited to share it with you as we continue the work. Jesse J. Benjamin and Asha T. Rodney, Atlanta, Georgia. Introduction. Regrounding the Intellectual Activist Model of Walter Rodney. Carol Boyce Davies. There are some classics in the library of Black Studies that have a narrative of their own, even for those who have never read these texts. One such text is Walter Rodney's The Groundings with My Brothers, which has particular historical resonance for several reasons. For one thing, its title, Groundings, captured the rooted exchange of knowledge between the academy and the community, without privileging the scholarly intellectual over the organic or community intellectual, which was his practice. For what Walter offered was a way of making knowledge serve the liberation of our communities from the oppressive European histories and epistemologies which seek to contain this knowledge, just as they historically contained our bodies. Groundings, then, offers that ability to make knowledge real and allow it to serve our communities, to return to base, as it were, to re-territorialize our understandings of the world. My working copy of Groundings is an old one, bought years ago at New Beacon Books, London, and is one of the editions published by Bogle-Louverture Publications, 1983, with a preface by the now-deceased Jessica Huntley and her partner, Eric L. Huntley, who themselves epitomize the link between Caribbean scholarship and activism. But this new edition advances Groundings to another readership, another generation, and a larger public, and is therefore usable in a number of teaching contexts in Africana studies, Caribbean studies, and related fields. The Groundings with My Brothers is organized into 6 chapters, based on speeches written at a time when a Black Power movement was active across the world, but particularly in the United States and the Caribbean. Chapter 1, Statement of the Jamaican Situation, addresses the condition of African-descended peoples in Jamaica. At the time of his writing, Walter felt that 100 years after emancipation, people were still blighted and oppressed, but also this time by local elites or Caribbean neocolonials who he calls representatives of metropolitan imperialist interests, page 3. Here he documents the still continuing police brutality, unemployment, and the stagnation in the rural areas where people were still eking out a living without the benefit of basic necessities. He stresses that this was still occurring over 100 years after emancipation in 1938, a date he indicates more than once in order to underscore what has failed to transpire in the intervening years. Defining global blackness and black power. Rodney's Groundings is significant for documenting and historicizing the meanings of global blackness and the internationalization of a discourse of black power in the context of African, Caribbean, and U.S. internal decolonization struggles, also called Black Power movements. 2 Black Power chapters are included. Chapter 2, Black Power, A Basic Understanding, and Chapter 3, Black Power, Its Relevance to the West Indies, and are important for those wanting to understand the practice and dimensions of Caribbean Black Power movements. While conceptually Black Power is often located only or primarily in the United States, Rodney's Groundings documents the impetus for this Caribbean political movement. While there was not a formal practice of Jim Crow segregation and racism, there were versions in the Caribbean, which I identify in Caribbean Spaces, and there were instances of de facto segregation. A country club in St. Clair, Port of Spain, which remained whites only for years and denied entry to a visiting African American staying at the Hilton Hotel who wanted to play tennis, is one example cited by activists there like Kafra Kamban, who indicated that this was one of the generative issues for Black Power activism in the Trinidad context. In fact, residential patterns in some communities linked class to race, and even carnival bands in Trinidad maintained, in this period, a naturalized racial hierarchy, which accorded participatory privileges to people on a color scale. Beauty queens were white or near white up until 1978, when Janelle Penny Commission won the Miss Universe competition. Banks hired only people of a certain lighter color tone. So, at the level of public practice, a European aesthetic which accorded privilege based on a certain constructed whiteness prevailed. Rodney's Black Power, A Basic Understanding, analyzes this practice of structural racism in the Caribbean, but it also indicates how this operates globally. For him, it is the conglomeration of white power which, under racism, excludes certain people or advances others based on race. He offers, then, an expansive definition of blackness in order to make his point. The black people of whom I speak, therefore, are non-whites, the hundreds of millions of people whose homelands are in Asia and Africa, with another few million in the Americas. A further subdivision can be made with reference to all people of African descent whose position is clearly more acute than that of most non-white groups, pages 9 to 10. As a historian, Rodney was able to use his research on the global black condition to elucidate the nature of racialized relationships using examples from places as far as Australia. He offers an analysis, then, of what he defines as the white power network, which, imperialist in nature, subordinates a range of peoples around the world, largely through violence. In this context, he includes the history of Caribbeans who struggled in the U.S. against this white power network, and, like Marcus Garvey, created political movements to redress this power imbalance, or, like Stokely Carmichael, were central to the definition and articulation of a challenging, oppositional black power context. Thus Rodney's closing definition: the interests of the blacks must be taken into account out of respect for their power that can be used destructively if it is not allowed to express itself constructively. This is what black power means in the particular conditions of the USA. Page 18. His particular delineation of the U.S. scenario sets the tone for black power, its relevance to the West Indies. In this chapter, he identifies the historical context for black subordination in the Caribbean, beginning with enslavement, specifying that the West Indies have always been a part of white capitalist society. Racism was built into the slavery project and linked economically, as Caribbean scholars such as C.L.R. James and Eric Williams have indicated. This is an important line which counters uninformed claims, based on the absence of visible segregation markers, that racism did not exist in the Caribbean. His assertion instead: the West Indies and the American South share the dubious distinction of being the breeding ground for world racialism. Page 21. Relevantly, in the context of current Caribbean reparations debates, he indicates that even with formal emancipation, there was European financial reparation and a continuance via apprenticeship which secured free labor for a number of years in order to maintain local whites in power. They therefore decided to give the planters £20 million compensation, page 21. In keeping with his own definition of global blackness, he includes the nature of Indian indentured labor in his analysis. For Rodney, black power in the West Indies pertains primarily to people who are recognizably African or Indian and has to do with anti-capitalism, political assertion, and cultural reconstruction. Walter Rodney's vision for the Caribbean was a society in which the middle class and intelligentsia served the general population, overcame cultural and economic imperialism, and were able to assert themselves as black people aesthetically, politically, socially, and economically. Thanks to his training in African history, Rodney provided for the Caribbean community concrete information about Africa that was not embedded in prejudice and negativity. His How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, is now a Black Studies classic. But before that, his 2 chapters in Groundings provided essential information which educated my generation of students. Chapter 4, African History and Culture, outlines essential information now taken for granted and supported by archaeological evidence. Africa is the home of mankind. He documents Nile Valley civilizations, the various African kingdoms such as Aksum and the Niger River West African kingdoms of Mali, Songhai, Ghana, and Kanem, but also Benin and Oyo, and the Central African and Southern African kingdoms as well. These are now fundamental understandings in a range of studies, documentaries, and educational contexts. But in 1969, when Groundings was written, this would have been among the few early articulations in a Caribbean context. For Rodney, this knowledge was essential to black people's well-being, to give them an understanding of past achievements and the present-day need for consciousness. His discussion about how human beings became who they are, as it transpired in Africa, was central to rejecting stereotypical epidermal racism and providing black people in the Caribbean with basic information to refute the larger epistemological claims which only reinforced European superiority. Clearly, his detail about the Ethiopian Church and Amharic culture would be also a central affirmation of Rastafari teachings in Jamaica, particularly in the celebration of the contributions of Ethiopia to world history. Regrounding Black Studies. As Rodney's work pertains to Black Studies, then, the Groundings with My Brothers provides useful and concise information for students who have perpetual questions about African civilizations, about why enslavement came to be normalized in the history of black people's experience. Chapter 5, African History in the Service of Black Revolution, demonstrates his intellectual/activist orientation, the application of knowledge in the service of black peoples. Central here was his recommendation for the teaching of African history in the public schools, which is still an incomplete decolonization issue. But beyond the public schools imperative, the universities remained a cause for concern. The study of African culture and history, dominated for a long time in African studies institutional contexts by European scholars, he felt tended to focus too much on kingdoms and nations and less on those outside those major states, therefore overlooking the majority of African people. Though at times idealized, basic African-generated social practices and courtesies for the treatment of people in communities were worthy, he thought, of consideration and evaluation as to their continued usefulness in the Caribbean. Above all, he imagined all the teachings of African history and contemporaneous discussions of global socioeconomic relations as having a revolutionary function in the Western Hemisphere. His was not the logic of romantic return, but of global implication and application. He saw for African diasporans an advanced role. Applied to New World blacks, this means in effect that the history nearest to revolutionary action will be the history of Africans in their new American environments. Page 62. The entry of Africana studies at the institutional level was meant to address the issue of representation at the level of thinking, and to at least provide a basis for challenging the overwhelming Eurocentricization of knowledge and the parallel creation of informed students, faculty, and administrators, and hopefully of community. Rodney also had an advanced position here, and besides his Dar es Salaam appointment, he had had institutional connections in places like Cornell University's Africana Studies and Research Center. Basically, racism's institutional superstructure of the Euro-American University still means that those who work in Africana studies operate in a field organized to counter a massive hegemonic Eurocentric knowledge edifice. While there have been numerous gains, a primary manifestation of institutional racism is a willful ignorance or avoidance which often dominates these institutions. This means that administrators and colleagues from other departments are often unable, uninformed, unwilling, or ill-equipped to represent the interests of these units in ways that benefit the advancement of knowledge. In the rest of the university, there is often only 1 or 2 faculty members in major departments, often none in other fields, and the rest of the university remains untouched. Students can go through the university and acquire a degree without taking one course that challenges Eurocentric thinking. And, more scandalously, colleagues in an Africana Studies department can espouse conservative, anti-black positions without fear of recrimination. One of the best anatomizations of this situation again comes from Sylvia Wynter's On How We Mistook the Map for the Territory and Re-Imprisoned Ourselves in Our Unbearable Wrongness of Being, of Desetre, Black Studies Toward the Human Project, 2005. She argues that once Black Studies entered the very order of knowledge it had contested, something different happened. This something different was indeed an attempt to operate by the standards of the existing academy, to get people tenured, promoted, to acquire the prizes of the academy such as named chairs, often with names that are highly suspect. Rodney refers, for example, to wealthy capitalists making money from exploiting people in locations outside of the United States, able to fund chairs and buildings with their ill-gotten gains. And above all, many Africana Studies departments buy into the same epistemological frameworks, for example, the disciplines, value certain kinds of work, certain kinds of publications, and so on. Wynter recalls some of those aesthetic and political movements which wanted a whole new system of ideas. Instead, we never arrived at the new territory, and remaining without the connection from the map to this new place. Instead of fully arriving at that territory or place where we could claim to rewrite the script of anti-blackness, we ended up being re-territorialized under Eurocentric whiteness and its assumption of the control of knowledge. So, as we operate today in the Academy, it is important to recall Walter Rodney's cautionary assertion. Black people are here in these institutions as part of the development of black struggle, but only as a concession designed to incorporate us within the structure. Besides the institution, he says, I am thinking also of the books, the references, the theoretical assumptions, and the entire ideological underpinnings of what we have to learn in every single discipline. In many ways, then, Black Studies / Africana Studies is caught in a paradox. Either be located in separate enclaves, which can eventually be incorporated or eliminated, or remain at the mercy of an institutional structure which has not really changed. But in my view, there is another option, one provided by radical intellectuals consistently, and which Edward Said had summed up well, namely, to always provide a counter-discourse in times when institutions want to create a certain normalization of oppression. Walter saw an even more advanced role for this scholar-activist, as an academic or intellectual who has to be able to go anywhere and to reason or ground, as the Rastafari community describes this process of engagement, with community and within his own discipline, has to attack those distortions which white imperialism, white cultural imperialism, has produced in all branches of scholarship. Page 66. Grounding and gendering the decolonial. Black Studies/Africana Studies was created in the same time frame as the various decolonization political movements, both in and outside of the Academy, to correct erasures of African presences and ongoing distortions. But thereby arose the issues of incorporation and the paradox of current location. New questions need to emerge, then, that can be brought forward for subsequent deliberation. How to ensure that all students are exposed to a range of knowledges as they make their way through the institution. How to restructure and move out of that order of knowledge in which a series of other human beings and the work they have produced, their epistemologies and ontological systems, remain outside of the frames of importance in the larger institutional contexts. So, what about the Groundings with My Sisters? In his final chapter, The Groundings with My Brothers, Walter is definite about talking to and with black men, his brothers. While at times he uses the generic man for humankind, in terms of the time frame when this work was produced, he was deliberately engaging black men in the diaspora and suggesting the need for black men to ground with each other. He is definite when he is referring to black people in general, as opposed to the black man, and in that wording, black people, that there exists the possibilities for extension. In The Groundings with My Sisters, Keisha Khan Perry offers a related vision which speaks to the gaps which left sisters out of being named fully in radical transformation. For Perry, the fact that black women have the poorest quality of life and the worst chances of survival, according to the Human Development Indexes for Latin American nations, such as Brazil, allows us to address how activist work is linked to the actual conditions of black women's lives. In this essay, she is deliberate about the diasporic dimensions of black women's experiences, but her work benefits from the 4 decades of black feminist scholarship produced since Walter Rodney's Groundings in 1969. This is a brief reflection on the diasporic dimension of black women's politics, specifically how black women in Latin America understand their experiences, identities, and social activism in relationship to other black women throughout the Americas. What interests me, in addition to the knowledge production and political organizing among black feminists in Latin America, are the various attempts at forming a transnational community of African descendant peoples in the anti-sexism and anti-racism struggle. Perry is deliberate about citing and using Rodney's Groundings as a framework for doing activist intellectual work that engages and reaches black communities, and she is definite about the transnational definitions of this project. In her words, the title Groundings with My Sisters expresses both my recognition of the interrelated complex experiences of black women globally and how this political positioning informs feminist and diasporic solidarity, and therefore feminist groundings. Her aim, then, is to expand the reach of the Rodney Project and to put it in conversation with Caribbean black left women like Claudia Jones, who were activists for women, the working poor, and black people, and to use the Groundings model as both an activist and intellectual framework for transformational politics. Here it is important to highlight another missing connecting point in decolonial discourses, and one which relocates Walter Rodney in current decolonial thinking. In the mid-1990s, sociology and philosophy students at Binghamton University, where Walter had also taught, created a coloniality working group. They organized a series of conferences, among them a Walter Rodney conference to ground or advance the analysis of continued colonial operations beyond Wallersteinian world systems theory. In that process, they deliberately engaged a visiting scholar, Aníbal Quijano, who was then theorizing his coloniality of power, which has since become a staple in decolonial theory. Central to this coloniality working group was the point that what is often erased or obscured is that the U.S. and Europe continue to have existing colonies, and that indigenous people and U.S. African Americans functioned as internally colonized. Thus, the students in particular, many of them African American, Latino, or white left Jewish, wanted to push Quijano to consider in his work not only these internal colonies, but also the subordinated black community.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?